Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jeff Sachs, Director of the Harvard Institute for International Development. And I can tell you that I can't think of a nicer occasion and a greater honor than the one that we have before us this evening. And you'll see why very shortly. First, let me say that this event with the President of Bolivia is jointly sponsored by Boston University, which very wisely bestowed an honorary degree on President Sanchez de Losada this afternoon, the Harvard Institute for International Development, the Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, the Mason Program, and the Kennedy School of Government. Everyone wanted a piece of this action, I can tell you, because we were all so thrilled when the opportunity arose. I'd like to introduce the President a little bit from a personal point of view, if you'll forgive me and permit me. My interaction with President Gonzalo Sanchez de Losada, or as everybody calls him, Goni, if all the country calls him that, began 12 years ago. 12 years ago, Bolivia was in as much chaos as is conceivable in a society not in a state of war. It was a country that was experiencing an inflation rate of about 40,000%. It's a country that in the preceding 5 years had had a decline in per capita income of about 35% over a 5-year period. It was a country that had, at the time, the world's record for political instability and was regarded as the essence of political instability. There were 13 heads of government between 1978 and 1983, and the situation seemed absolutely hopeless to most people at the time. I had the absolute life-changing good fortune to be asked by some former students to come down for a visit to have a look at what might be done to help stop the hyperinflation. And I will never forget the first evening there at a cocktail party. After we had started our work for the day, a stranger approached me at the party and said, "So what are you thinking?" And I started to describe how we thought that the issue, with my colleague Felipe Lorraine, who's here, and at the invitation of Ronnie McLean, mayor of La Paz, who's here now at Harvard University, I said that we thought that the essence of the problem was to control the money supply and get the inflation to stop. And this gentleman said, "Well, yes, but what are you going to do about tariffs? What are you going to do about licensing? What are you going to do about ownership? What are you going to do about," and he proceeded on a list of 20 things, and I, with the school book wisdom of the day, said, "Well, those are things that should be in the future, you know, the main thing is to stabilize now." And the fellow said, no, you don't understand, you know, you have to do everything. You have to eliminate the tariffs immediately. You have to eliminate the licenses. You have to open up the economy instantly. You have to, and went on and on. So I decided, definitely agent provocateur. This was a guy who was getting me to say something absolutely nuts so that I would get thrown out of the country the next day. The alternative theory was completely drunk. I never considered the third possibility, which was that he was completely right. And what I heard for the first time in my life was the concept of democratic-based radical economic reform, which, according to our textbooks of the day, was inconsistent, impossible to achieve, not very desirable anyway, simply the wrong way to go. Every time I get blamed for shock therapy, I have to tell you, he invented it. He invented the concept of how to turn around a country that was at the last edge of its civil survival. Goni operated with virtually no models at the time. His conceptual model, I remember distinctly, was Ludwig Erhard, and the idea, at least, of a radical push to stabilization and to markets. But Ludwig Erhard had operated in a completely different context 40 years earlier. And the only analogy of any sort at the time was the Chilean experience, next door of so-called neoliberal reforms, but everybody knew, first of all, that those were being done by one of the harshest regimes in the world, and they couldn't possibly serve as a role model. Under Goni's leadership, Bolivia became the first country to prove that economic reform and democratization could simultaneously be pursued, and absolutely be pursued in a way in which one would mutually support the other process. He had the wisdom and insight and humanity to understand that that could be done at a time when almost every expert told him it could not be. His temperament, his political genius, his economic insight, good choice of advisors once in a while, and his style of work is what made it possible to have one of the most remarkable programs of political and social and economic democratization and reform and recovery that the world has seen in the modern era. The style of work is absolutely distinctive. I don't wish it on everybody. Goni doesn't have a kitchen cabinet. He has a long kitchen table. And you sit for hours and days and weeks and months pondering in incredible detail the great issues before the country. And it's been my personal great pleasure to sit at that table and learn at the hand of one of the great political masters how this kind of reform can be carried out. But Goni is a president that not only masters the broad picture and not only gives the broad leadership, but masters the fine details and is intimately involved in some of the most creative and constructive and innovative reforms that the world has seen. I learned an enormous amount. I'm indebted for a lifetime to this man because he really showed what could be done and taught what could be done. I want to insist to you, and it's not just it's not false flattery, and it's not just pleasantries for an occasion. I've had the opportunity after that, because of the fact that Goni made me look good and helped me to look good. I've had the opportunity to know lots of presidents and prime ministers and economy ministers around the world, and I have not met one that is the equal of this man. He is a world-class figure. He is a world-class political, economic intellect. He is one of the most amazing world leaders that we have. It's rare. It's, of course, unexpected to meet a figure like this anywhere. It is a fact that for Bolivia to produce a figure that has been now teaching the world is an extraordinary and wonderful occasion. His genius, his charm, his humor, his patriotism, his incredible love of the people of his country are the most moving and inspiring things that I've seen in my career. And so it is with enormous honor and pleasure and privilege that I have the opportunity to introduce to you the President of Bolivia, Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada.
Well, I want to make a comment. There's a saying that behind every great man, there's a surprise mother-in-law. And after this introduction, there's a very surprised president. I have spent 4 years listening to all types of insults and rejections, and I'm just not ready for it. And all through this introduction, I was saying, who, me? I'm sure Jimena was as surprised as I was, or as her mother was. Truthfully, looking back, when I was asked to put a title of the problems of change in Bolivia, I sent up the title of this talk, which of course was not, I didn't have time to prepare anything, but I thought it was a good idea to talk about the problems of change, period. And I will mention something that I mentioned, that I used in my speech, and you won't have to hear the same talk, my remarks at the honoris causa at Boston University today. But at my inauguration, my sister gave me a 19th century copy of Machiavelli's The Prince. And as I opened it, I saw a paragraph saying, I do not recommend that the Prince install change, because those affected realize it immediately, those benefited take a long time. And I have to say that once we had been successful with the generous help of many people, Jeff among them, and many committed Bolivians and very good friends from other countries. And once we had achieved stability, political stability, and economic stability, and social stability, we realized that we had to go ahead, and I realized that there was a terrible imperative, because the wall in Berlin had fallen, and Bolivia's macroeconomical and social stability was based on foreign aid. And when the wall went down, we realized quickly that that the dynamic of foreign aid was the world struggle, the bipolar struggle that took place between Soviet Russia and the United States. And I was reminded deeply of de La Rochefoucauld's great phrase that nothing is more bearable than other people's problems. And I was astounded to see how Americans and Germans and Japanese had terrible personal problems. It moved me. And they weren't at all interested in the poor of Africa, Latin America, or even in their own countries, but they had big problems. And so I realized there was a moral imperative, a Kantian imperative to install change, that the window was closing. Unluckily, under the great leadership of Victor Paz Estenssoro, the founder of my party, 78 years old when he came into government for the third time, 82 years old when he left. Although we had been able to achieve stability, and stability political meant that we were, of course, in the very good situation, and I think it's very important to comment on it, and start out with change when you're talking about hyperinflation. There's a moment in hyperinflation where prices start going up faster than the currency devalues. The expectation turns around and the price goes up, and the ability to speculate on the currency slows down, and at that moment nobody is getting gains from hyperinflation. because hyperinflation is a wonderful reverse tax. It makes the richer much richer and the poor much poorer. So it's never really stopped until the rich start feeling the effect of inflation. The poor can't stop it. And the rich, of course, can when they see that it's no longer business. They can never have the protections. They've lost the ability to protect themselves through currency speculation or other types of accumulation. And it was surprising, and Jeff rightly describes, we expected the worst, but we saw, and Dr. Paz saw, that the country was going to die. We sat down and we made an estimation of inflation, and we figured that in 6 months' time, we would need wheelbarrows and evening payments, everyday payments of salaries to be able to keep the economy running. And in 1 year, we would exceed Germany. I'm sorry we didn't try it because we'd be in the Guinness Book of Records. But we would pass the 1,000,000%, and probably quicker, because as Jeff says, we suffered big external shocks. 50% drop in the price of tin and tungsten, our basic exports, a 50% drop in the price of petroleum. At that time, it dropped from $30 down to 15 and less. And these were our exports. So, but once we stopped the hyperinflation, we realized that one of the things that is very valuable with stopping a hyperinflation is that people get the benefits. They see it immediately. They see a price stability immediately. And that's the type of change which you want, where people can see results that affect their lives immediately, and not, like Machiavelli said, those affected realize it immediately, those benefited take a long time. And this situation made it that Victor Paz's and Soto's government was very popular when the party elected me to be the candidate. So popular that I won the election. And unluckily was the victim of a stolen election through a rigged electoral court, which permitted the number 2 man to vote in the number 3 man. In Bolivia, we have a constitutional arrangement where you go to a proportional election, proportional representation election, and then the president is elected in the Congress. It's a sort of semi-presidential, parliamentarian system. And then the president, now through constitutional change, the next president will have 5-year tenure. I had 2-year, and we'll have the election will be between number 1 and number 2. It may sound pretty crazy, but it obliges the president to put together a coalition and be able to govern, because there's nothing worse, if you haven't heard, than having the Congress in one party's hands and the presidency in another party's hands. People say the Americans want that. I know they don't, because 80% of them voted for one or the other party, and in all the polls they don't want it. And tell me, it's a very difficult situation to get anything done. I don't know what President Clinton's going to do, but generally you don't do anything if you have that situation. The Bolivian experience was that after that, I got down to a very important job in democracy, and that's being the leader of the opposition. And it gave me time, because I saw in the polls that people were very conscious that I was an honest and capable man, able to undertake great economic and government challenges. But people had a lot of doubt about whether I really understood or cared about their problems. And so, to be able to compensate that for the next election, I started going to villages, to neighborhoods. I started talking to people. Better said, I started listening to people, which is the hardest thing to do for a politician. But anyways, I sat down and listened to their problems. And as so many times happens, I understood that what they wanted above all was attention. And I started to understand their problems and was able to envisage a plan for change that would reflect the great change that had taken place in the world. It was absolutely unviable for Bolivia in any case, but more so after the Berlin Wall had fallen, to continue to be dependent on foreign aid to close its external trade trade gaps and to meet its budget deficits. And this reality of being in contact with them, I realized that Bolivia also needed very deep changes, and it brought home to me something that I want to talk about in change. One of the big burdens that we carry as in Western thought is the strength of our Aristotelian definition of man as matter and spirit. And this makes us think that man can be looked at as matter and spirit. If we look at it Oriental, or as the Orientals look at it, it's a total whole. You can't separate it. And you know you can't separate a man. Where's the spirit and where's the matter? And material. And I think that what I began to understand, and it seems to be accepted wisdom now, is that there's no solution to economic problems if you don't solve political problems. The reason we were able to stop the hyperinflation is because we found a political solution. Hyperinflation is a political problem. It's not an economical problem. It can be caused by one, but the solution is political. You have to have a government that can take decisions. Two, there's no doubt that development is a social problem. It's not an economic problem, as we're now learning, and we are now understanding that none of this can work without another dimension, which is the social dimension. We are all learning that education is as important for development as savings, and savings is also social. So you really start understanding in the matters of development that there's also, we're now understanding, the fourth dimension is that you can't do any of this without respect for environment. That's the fourth dimension of development, and it's the fourth dimension of change, which I became very conscious of it as I saw the great poverty in my country was basically a problem of environment, of mistreatment of natural resources by the loss of practices in agriculture and in social cohesion that had led to this. And I became very impacted by what I didn't hear it directly, but I heard it from a campesino who told me that God forgives always, man sometimes, nature never. And this was the type of wisdom that came home to me as I listened to people, especially poor people. And I realized there was absolutely imperative to do change, and I won an election based on a plan called A Plan for Everyone, a comprehensive plan for change, supposing naively that if I told people what I was going to do and if I could win the election, I could do that. And of course, I didn't understand that people love to hear things from politicians, but they hate to have them done. And they never expected a politician to do exactly what he promised. And when he did it, they were very unhappy. They wanted change. They realized that change was necessary. They realized that the country had to change profoundly, but they didn't want, all the blood and gore that accompanies change. And I think that's a very important part, because a country like Bolivia is a very feudal country. We're all fighting every day more to have a bigger piece of an ever shrinking pie. The concept of having a bigger pie and everybody having a bigger piece is unacceptable. We belong to medieval Spanish colonial tradition that's based on having more of less instead of less of more. the concept of solidarity does not exist in our elites' thinking, where it is very strong in our social basis, community-based thinking. So I won that next election by a landslide. And I had the type of authority to be able to implement this very innovative plan. And it was a plan that tried to be coherent, tried to be comprehensive, and of course, it tried to be revolutionary if we accept, and I again go back to what Jeff said, all change to be successful has to be revolutionary. And let's define the word revolutionary. If we define revolutionary that it goes outside of the framework of established law, I don't mean that. I mean radical change that is irreversible. And that, for me, is revolutionary change. And to be able to do that type of change, it has to be absolutely coherent. And I found myself with one term of office, I can stand for election after the next, under Bolivian Constitution, you can't stand for immediate re-election. Theoretically, you can stand after one period. The next president will have 5 years because we also changed the Constitution. We realized that, number one, 4 years is too little time to get change done. More or less the cycle, and I'm trying to make a few rules which are obviously arbitrary, but trying to make your time here useful and put out some hypotheses. We changed government, the period of the president to 5 years, because we feel that it's about the time cycle that you can make change, implement it, and see the results before the next election. And I was inspired, and I'm up against this problem today, because I remember when I was made a candidate back in 1989 after the stabilization program, I made an acceptance speech at the convention saying that a statesman worries about the next generation, a politician about the next election. Dr. Pasas Tensoro, a man of 50 years experience, called me into his office and he said, you know, among the people I've worked with in these 50 years, public service, I think that you are one of the statesmen, or you potentially can be it, but there's not many of them, and I think you could be. But tell me, how are you going to win the next election? And that's the problem. A statesman has to be able to govern for the next generation and win the next election. And I'm not talking about win the next election as a candidate. I think that although the polls show that I couldn't win if I was permitted by the Constitution to run, I think in the last moment, like happens so many times in life and in marriage, people would say, well, we don't like it, but we better stay with it. The next may be worse. I think the importance of continuity is very important, but whatever you do, if you can stand for re-election or if you can't, the big challenge in change is you have to win the next election. And how can you do it? First of all, 5 years, so that you can plant, you can cultivate, you can harvest, and you can distribute the harvest. Let's say the 3 steps. You can plant, cultivate, and harvest. It takes about a 5-year cycle. Second thing is you have to make change that's so coherent, that's so comprehensive, that's so radical, that the harvest will be abundant, because little pieces of change are not acceptable. And that's the second challenge. And it's a challenge that goes against the way we think, lineal think, and we have to think in an organic manner, that all change has to have touch on the 4 dimensions: social, political, economic, and environment, which is the 4th dimension of change in sustainable development. Now, coming back to the realities of this plan for everyone had a series of things. First of all, it was based, I would say, on 4 principles. One is decentralized society, because Bolivia was, as I said, from colonial times, highly centralized, and we had to, I felt, give power back to the people. devolution. It had to be decentralized. It had to be productive, because the number one problem in the world, maybe except for the United States, is the creation of jobs, not only in poor countries, in developed countries. Ask the Europeans, especially for young people. And it has to be growing. You have to have the locomotive of economic growth that can give you the wherewithal for social growth, for environmental development, that you can do it together, and finally political stability. So it had to be productive, and it also had to be redistributive. Bolivian society is very poor, but the differences between the rich and poor, and I want you to understand, even the rich are poor in Bolivia. But yet, the difference between the poor rich and the poor poor in Bolivia is almost 30 times. And that's where the great deal of the problem is, in distribution of wealth. So the old theory that you can first create wealth and then get the trickle down just doesn't work. You have to redistribute political power, wealth. You have to have and finally you had to bring down hyper-corruption, which is as dangerous for a society as hyperinflation. It exists. Inflation accompanies us since the Chinese invented paper money, and corruption exists with humanity since Eve offered the apple to Adam. But the problem is to keep it down uncontrollable single-digit levels and not get it hyper. And then you can live with it. It makes life better, but you can't get it out of control. The elements, these four elements, were the basis of the analysis of this situation, and therefore we thought of it by doing what we call popular participation. We took 20% of all of Bolivia's income. I won't tell you the fiscal problems paying for these reforms. The greatest merit that we have is that we were able to maintain stability with this amount of change, because that's another challenge. How do you change things if you can't maintain social, economic, and political stability? But anyways, we made the change, and this means that 20% of the government's income, of the country's income, goes as revenue sharing to municipal governments, which are now territorial. And we distribute this according to the number of people who live there. Nothing about this reverse or, of trying to compensate for poverty or anything like that. Bolivian people are very happy to have two things: one vote, one person, revenue sharing, the same revenue sharing for every Bolivian, wherever he lives, whoever he is, whatever he believes in. So we take it and we distribute it to the municipalities according to their population. And the other thing we did was combine the counties with municipal government. There's no way that you can have local government that doesn't take into account the countryside, the environment, and in Bolivia, that doesn't break down the distance between the urban and the rural. Because the cities in Bolivia had been, since colonial times, medieval cities. The tax collectors lived there, the police lived there, the landlords lived there, and the government authorities and justice lived there. So you had to get it away, and of course they lived there exploiting the countryside, the Indian communities, and the people that were subjugated by the Spanish conquest. So we got this going where we set up this income distribution. We created territorial municipalities, and what we did, and I think that that's an important context to have it in, is that we created an oversight committee. These municipal governments, which are the traditional Western institutions where you have a mayor and you have a council, an executive and a legislative, and they are under the supervision, an oversight committee called a vigilance committee, which is organized by the communities, the rural and urban communities, many of them pre-Columbian, that elect an oversight committee. Every community has one vote, and they elect an oversight committee, and they have veto power on the budget, and they have to see the accounts at the end of the year, and they have to have social control over the execution of that budget. It doesn't work perfectly, we're still arguing that, but anyways, it was a very interesting idea of taking what I would call an Oriental base, which is 60% or almost 2/3 of the Bolivian people are native, either Aymara, Quechuas, or Guaranis, and these people have very strong community and family institutions that have survived colonialism, republicanism, and a lot of other things that have happened in our country. And so these institutions, we tried to bring from above Western institutions, municipalities, revenue sharing, together with these other institutions that have their traditional leadership and combine them into a from down above and from above. Now, once we had done this, it couldn't work. We had 311 municipalities created, territorial municipalities, and they had funds. They had terrible responsibilities. They were responsible for administering education and for the infrastructure and materials, health. The central government gives the teachers and the health workers. They were culture and sports, county roads, nutrition, and development. Now, this needed something between central government, and as we have a unified state, we're not federal, thank God, I don't think we could afford it, but we then had to deconcentrate and make administrative decentralization. So we have an administration in every region. There's 9 departments, and they do public investment, they do everything. The president names the prefect again, so you have a unified government, and down below, again, the municipalities get together, all their councilors get together from each province, and they elect a representative to what's called the departmental council, where they are councilors, and there you don't have a legislative and executive dynamic. The prefect presides over the council, but the council does budget, approves contracts. It's again a mixture of oversight and a mixture of an executive branch, like a board in a corporation or in a university. Now, these factors of social change, of course, have led to the fact that when I came into government, 25% of national expenditures and investment were at a local level. Now 75% are at the local level. I'm working very hard so nobody will want to be president. If I have a few more months left, maybe I can get that down to 80-20, and then it'll really be worth. We have the army, we have the diplomats, and we have other things, but we basically have decentralized the administration of the country. The second thing that we did, looking for redistribution of wealth, because this is obviously redistributive, it's decentralizing, we went into deep educational reform, accepting, and the Bolivian people, poor people understand that, and as I talked to them in the years I was in the opposition, I understood very clearly that they know that educated countries become rich, not rich countries educate. And we went into educational reform with 3 facets. Again, it was put under the administration of local government, although the central government controlled the teaching, but it had some aspects that were very important for our country. Number 1, it's education based on bilingualism. You learn to read and write and arithmetic in your own native language, in your mother tongue, which are 4, Spanish, Aymara, Quechua, and Aymara. There's a lot of other small languages in the tropical area, but we haven't got to that. But these, we learned, and it's based on, it's not because we want to protect per se ethnic values and culture, because the people who belong to these ethnic cultural groups are very proud of them, but they want to become part of the modern, prosperous world, and they realize that they can only do that if they become modern. But we've learned that children who learn how to think, who learn how to conceptualize in their own mother language, then quickly go into any language, Hebrew, Chinese, English, French, of course Spanish. But if you grab these children, as we were doing, throw them into a classroom, and where the teachers are from their same social strata, but are obliged to teach them in Spanish, they all abandon school quickly. And when I look in TV shows and see the arguments of bilingualism, nobody wants to not speak well the language of the society in which they are, but they will only speak it well if they learn to read and write and arithmetic in their mother tongue. So in the first years of education, even if it's a very special type of ghetto English, they have to learn in that language, because that's where you form the conceptual and the analytical ability to be able to be useful and absorb thinking. The minute they do it, they become magnificently bilingual, because children have that great ability if you give them a chance. It's like a peach tree. If you use a strong base, a strong stock, and that will resist everything, and that is your mother tongue, your culture, your family, and then you graft to it a wonderful, sophisticated type of peach, you'll have a great tree, because it'll resist all types of disease and will produce a wonderful fruit. And that's basis number one. Basis number two is national testing standards, so we can know if people in the countryside and all that are getting, and finally accreditation done by an autonomous group elected by 2/3 of the Senate that can control the accreditation process. This has been resisted to the death by the teachers' union. Bolivia has the great benefit of having the world's biggest Trotskyite party, and they run the teachers' union. And they fought and marched in the streets, and it was just havoc because they were dead against it. The universities, public universities, were dead against it. They didn't want standardized testing. They didn't want accreditation. And all the people in education didn't want it, because it also means accreditizing, giving credit and standardized testing to public education, and that's where they were really indignant. It's all right for private education, but not for national fiscal education. So, but this has wonderful support from the people, but it's from the people. The people in the polls love it. They believe in it. The parents, the whole country believes in this, but again, it was a case of those affected realize it immediately. Those benefited take a long time. Our next step was to find how to create a productive society, and we had the problem that, as Jeff once said to me, Bolivia's economy was very much like Poland. All the rural part was, after land reform in 1952, all the rural part was in the hands of small peasant farmers, some commercial farmers where we were developing commercial agriculture in the tropical part of Bolivia that was opening up. But all 80% of productive industrial activity was in the hands of the state. The only difference between Poland and Bolivia is that you couldn't privatize it. Poland you can, Bolivia you couldn't. And therefore, I went back, because my family came from a landowning family. My father was a diplomat and was exiled because he believed in land reform. Being a landowner was pretty outrageous. And I went back to what had been our lands, our traditional family lands in the valley of Cochabamba, and I talked to a peasant farmer who, when I would visit this farm as a child, because my father couldn't come back, I would play with him, and I got to be a friend as a child. And I went back to visit him, and I said, "How was land reform for you?" And he said to me, "Well, land reform gave me land, but it didn't give me the wherewithal to really make that land productive." So I had three solutions. I could sell it, and even if I spend the money wisely on the health and education of my family, at the end, I will have no money and I will have no land. Two, I could go and borrow money And he did not study, this peasant farmer did not study at Harvard, but he said a great truth. He said, if you borrow money from especially money lenders, there's three things that grow while you sleep. One are crops, the other's children, and the other's interest. So I will be, again, a peon, a peasant slave, if I do this. So what I do is I invite in my godfather, who lives in the town, and he puts up the money for fertilizer and seed, and I put up the land. We work it together, and then if we have a good year, we divide, we do very well. If we don't have a good year, then we end up with the problem of having at least enough money to be able to buy seed and fertilizer, and I have enough money to survive. So that's where we fought up capitalization. As privatization was a dirty word, and we had to decentralize from the public sector out to the private sector the productive activities for reasons of controlling corruption and achieving efficiency. We found that it could be done if we invited strategic partners to become our partners. We didn't sell anything. They became our partners by having a capital investment made, and the money went to the company. It didn't go to the government to be able to misspend it or make pyramids or roads or arches of triumph. It went into the companies, and that way there would be job creation, modernization, especially in these basic monopolies like telecommunications, petroleum, the railroads, airlines, mining, and smelting, and electric generation and distribution and transmission. This worked out very successfully because we also decided that what belonged to the Bolivian people should be given back to the Bolivian people. And this was income distribution. But wisely, with advice from Jeff and other people, I had thought as a politician that the best I could do is give them shares in these companies, these capitalized companies, their shares. And I found that the Bolivian people wanted it to serve a social purpose. They didn't know what they would do with shares. As we did the polls and as we talked to people, we found that the people said, well, we will misspend this money. My husband will drink it away. My son will use it on loose women. They were very disconfident about getting shares that nobody knew what it was worth. And we decided very wisely, I think, to remember Franklin D. Roosevelt and create Social Security in Bolivia. So now they get a bonus. These shares generate approximately $400 a year for every Bolivian over 65 years of age. We've started out with $250, and that will be available to all Bolivians who today have 18 years or more. And they, when they arrive at that age, will get this wonderful bonus called the Solidarity Bonus, Bono Sol, Sol being sun. And this doesn't sound like much, but when you have a country whose per capita income is $800, $400 is for many people more than they make all year long. And if you look at the fact that the poor in Bolivia get $2 a day and the really poor get $1 a day, $250 is a lot of money, especially in the rural areas of Bolivia. And it also has a big effect. It makes people conscious of the fact that old people have something to contribute. They become valuable. They are supported in Bolivia by the family. And as they are supported by the family, it gives them back dignity. Because usually they're very worried about being a weight on the family and to keep them alive and to pay for their health. Now they will have an income every year, and the most important thing is that this bonus is probably for the great majority of Bolivians the first time they see that amount of money together, meaning they have the possibility to make an investment decision. Somebody said, I can buy a cow and my family will have milk from a cow. And if I can live 20 years, I'm 65, and if I can hold on till 85, I will be able to buy 20 cows. And those cows will have cows. And I will leave my family a small group, a small group of cows. And this is something that's unbelievable to a person who is a weight for his family, respected and cared for, but the challenge is very great, and it's based on, many people have screamed and yelled, you should have sold those shares, you should use that money to make roads, make schools, make dams, and I've said it belongs to them. Give it back to them. They'll do a great job with it. I'm confident they will. And truthfully, it is also the most revolutionary step ever taken in all of the existence of humanity, because it's the only step that I know of that gets women to declare that they're older than they are. One of our big problems is many poor people are coming in to say, I'm older than I am because I want to get the, add on a few years, which is very tough for the people who've been taking off years. But anyways, the social dynamic of this thing of giving them back what belongs to them, because state-owned companies, when it was in the hands of the state, they were the people's companies. We've been criticizing for giving away all these wonderful companies to the foreign capital, and the truth is that these companies, we never sold anything, and what is the participation of the Bolivian people is going back to them for this mechanism. So I think that when we look at that, this was obviously accompanied by a very radical pension fund, individual capitalization, the way the Chileans do it, because these shares of these capitalized companies are now being administrated privately. These private companies pay the bonus, I'm sorry to say, because if I could pay it, I could win the next election, but they pay the bonus all. And finally, the most important aspect in all of this is that now the pension fund system, which only covered a very small percentage of our population, 75% of the people were public employees, teachers and other people like that, we have been able to, by doing this, create a system that when this runs out, when everybody who's 18 years of age dies off and these shares have been used up, we hope that it will be replaced by a pension fund system of individual capitalization. You have a payroll deduction, but it's privately invested, and you can retire when your contributions to that have achieved at least a 70% horizon. Now, this is based on Chile. We think it'll create a market which Bolivia never had, with the capitalized company shares and with these shares, and create the sort of growth and market that can have capital formation and some of the saving levels and horizons that have escaped Latin America for many reasons. We hope that in part of it it'll go. To finish all of these changes and the difficulty of changes, when you do that much in 4 years, obviously you can't see the harvest. And there's nothing more bitter than work for somebody you don't even know, and you probably won't like, and that's the next president. But below it all, you're working for the Bolivian people. You're trying to change social aspects, redistributive aspects, and above all, you're getting away through social control and decentralization and all these other steps, private pension fund administrators, you're getting away from corruption. And there is a big reward in all of this and a big consolation. The first reward is that there's few presidents who have the political power, the party loyalty, the acceptance of the people, like happened in Bolivia, to accept all this change, even though they may not have liked it and may have questioned it deeply. It is unbelievable that this country has such a respect for freely elected presidents and constitutional due process of law, that the laws that they can't understand and they're offended by and that they've been told is absolutely damaging to national sovereignty and to the future of their families, they say, okay, it's done right, we'll support it, and we'll see if it works. And finally, the last satisfaction and change is that I looked at the polls of the previous president, who did very little, if not nothing. He did reform the electoral system so that I could be elected, so I recognize that. But when I look at that, his popularity at this time was less than mine. And I'm really pleased to say I have a very solid constituency. less than 6 years of age and over 60. I've lost all the middle. And I'm asking for a constitutional reform where only those children, only those people who go up to 18 years can vote. From 18 years on, nobody can vote. And I feel that the satisfaction of knowing that you're working for people who just judge you on what the vibrations you give out is the big satisfaction of any man who does change. I'll get very worried when the children aren't affectionate and don't say hello to me. And when the older people say, you know, we're getting back what we worked for all our life. So the consolation in this is change is very difficult, but the reward is great. And the threat is great. If you don't use power to change the society you live in, you will soon find yourself as punished by not doing anything as you would have done if you did a lot. Because popularity must be invested. It cannot be maintained, and it's better to invest it wisely, not fritter it away, because then you will, in time, have a reward and an abundant harvest. Thank you very much.
This is a tough crowd. That doesn't happen all the time.
They were brainwashed.
I remember talking to Goni the night that the last piece of this whole program was passed, and he said it was wonderful. The last stage of reform occurred exactly as his popularity reached zero. So it was right. So it was perfectly well harvested to complete the program. Well, I think you've seen and heard a lot. We have time, of course, for discussion, questions, observations. There are 2 microphones. People that would like to use the microphone, please come forward and if you would introduce yourselves, I think the President would appreciate it and the rest of the audience would appreciate it.
Hi, I'm Martin Escobari. I'm from Bolivia. I'm now at the business school, Harvard Business School. I think by any yardstick, you have to judge your reforms as revolutionary, and also to give you credit, you've gotten a partial harvest. Maybe you didn't have your 5 years, but you had 4 years, and there's some very tangible successes. But at the same time, the polls are unforgiving with you and your party. You said the nature of change is that's one of the trade-offs you need to do. Would you have done anything differently to change the polls today?
Obviously, and it was very easy to do, and that was to have contact with people. I won elections by being very much in contact with people, but the agenda of change I fixed for myself was so ambitious that the conceptualization, as you've heard, you know, and when you do capitalization or privatization, you have to create a whole regulatory. We changed the forestry law, the land tenure law, the Constitution. We reformed the judicial and the executive branch. Well, there was so much to do and so much work that I became a mad alchemist. You know, working day and night in this in the palace, in this tower, and a prisoner in the palace. And I didn't go out to do it, but there was a question of time. I enjoyed being in contact with people, and if you explain to people, and as I go out now to say I've kept my promises with you, they say, well, why didn't you say so? Many people on a human level don't really, first of all, it takes a while for them to see all the results. And I must say, the consolation in the polls is that the people are very convinced that these measures have to stay. That's number one. Number two, they are forgetting, thank God, the way they were done, you know, very, you know, the votes in the Congress and getting them done and implemented. And there's no doubt that the big problem, it's a question of time going out to talking to people. If you have an agenda, and maybe the big deficiency was I tried to do too much, but I don't know if you can really, as I said, that's one of the hypotheses I maintained in this talk. If change is not comprehensive and coherent, it will fall apart. You can't just change this and change that. It has to be a really structural effort if you're going to if the rewards are going to be there. So as I say, the questions are more a question of style, a question of the perception that they were imposed, and that people say, well, where's the beef? Where are the results? And that's something that they will see in time and are already seeing. There's a grudging acceptance, sort of like Margaret Thatcher. What I did was good for you. And as time goes by, the people are willing to accept that. But I had trade-offs, and I took those hard decisions because I preferred, maybe it was intellectual arrogance, but I felt I had to get it done. And of course, I don't say that I've changed everything. There's a lot we had a small seminar here, and there's a lot to be done. This is the beginning, not the end. But you had to get it all implemented, going, so that it could really be effective, and it had to be coherent to change the society into a participative democracy, a productive democracy, and above all, a just democracy. And this had to be done with this tremendous agenda that didn't give me time to go out and talk to people. And as I say, the old people know it's right, the kids know it's right. I'm just struggling with these ignorant grown-ups.
But unlike Margaret Thatcher, will you run again in 5 years?
Well, I don't know. Just like her, I'd probably be old and gray at that. I'm already old and gray. But I threaten people that I'll come back. But anyways, I don't know.
After the first question, I was still in doubt if I should ask mine, because it's very similar. I had the chance to meet you in the campaigns in Cochabamba with people like Alberto Gasser and all these times when you were traveling in and out almost every day. After all these, the reforms you made, what would you consider mistakes?
Well, I would need another seminar for that. The biggest mistake, I think, was lack of time and explanation, and we did a lot of it, but remember, the constituencies that are against this change are very vocal. For instance, what made it very hard to do education reform was the leitmotif of the unions that I was going to privatize education. So you'd explain it over and over again, and until they saw the results, there is an awful lot that was done wrong. And I think the other thing is it wasn't done fast enough, but I don't know if it could have been done. The big problem about creative change, it's much better to apply more standard change. Many people said, why didn't you privatize? And why didn't, we did it the hard way. We thought it up a new way to do everything. And so there's probably, as I said before, you need an awful lot of a good president should spend a third of his time, let's say, telling people what he's doing, and two, governing and free legislature. I was doing legislation for 2/3 of the time and trying to govern for 1/3. I had very little time to be in contact with people, although I enjoyed it and would have been useful. But I don't know if I could have done it differently. Anyways, I did it, and it was done that way. And there's obviously many deficiencies and many defects. The thing is that it's very hard to do so much in 4 years. As I get together after being president, I'll be able to tell you a lot more about what I did wrong.
Mr. President, my name is Guillermo Isashuli. I'm a student at the Canada School. I'm taking a Professor Sachs class, and during every class, your name comes out.
He gets a retainer.
I have to pay royalties today. What are you talking about?
Also, I have a friend, a very close friend from Argentina, and yesterday he told me that if we were to have a position of the president of Latin America, this is the man for this job.
Very kind.
I kind of didn't believe neither Professor Sachs nor my friend, but I must say today I'm so impressed what he had to say. I'm coming from the country which is almost in the same situation as you described Bolivia was. I'm from Republic of Georgia. We have different problems, but you mentioned about sustainability.
Tolstoy says all unhappy families are different. All happy families are the same.
Right. You mentioned that every statesman should think about the new generation, and you're gonna pretty soon be out of a job. And what do you think? What did you do in terms of keeping this process going? What kind of institutions did you put in place which guarantees irreversibility? And how do you think Bolivia will sustain this process?
Well, that's hard to say. The history of Bolivia has been, you know, Lenin used to say 1 step back, 2 steps forward. In Bolivia, we've been doing 2 steps back and 1 step forward, so I can't say what will happen. And the only thing is that I think many of these changes, once you've given power back to the people, like popular participation, it's very hard to take it away from them. They are very proud of solving their own problems. They feel included for the first time. When we came into government, 92% of revenue sharing stayed in free cities. And now, of course, it's almost the reverse because we now give it according to the population. So I don't think that'll be changed. We're very worried about administrative decentralization because we are scared that there's people talking about doing political decentralization. That could lead to disintegration. I'm worried about that. Educational reform has a long ways to go. We have not, and answering the previous question, we have not been successful getting that going. We had very strong leaders in capitalization, very strong leaders in popular participation. We should have made a ministry without portfolio to handle it. All reform should have a leader. The president shouldn't only take the responsibility. So I think educational reform is something that worries me a great deal because there's a lot to be done, and I don't know if it will be done. Capitalization, I don't think will ever be changed. It's very criticized. Everybody says we've given away the national patrimony, but the true owners of those companies are receiving their bonus, and I don't think you'll ever be able to take it away from old people because there's too many family. You know, every person who's in Bolivia is 65. Most of them have children and grandchildren, and it just won't work to take it away from them. Finally, pension fund reform, again, for people to see every month where their money is, how it grows, how it's administered, to be able to have the freedom to go to another pension fund administrator if they don't like the way it's being managed. I think these things will be irreversible. I'm worried about administrative decentralization and about education because we didn't do it very well. There's a lot to be done. And I don't think there'll be big changes, but of course all of these measures need a great deal of cultivation and affection and understanding and of what's being involved. But I think the Bolivian people, we've seen it in the polls, they know that what's been done has to be maintained, and I think the political people will, once the election is over, do that. And they also know that although it was done quickly and surgically, it had to be done that way, otherwise it would have never been done.
My name is Fernando
Could you
Basso.
speak up, everybody, because it's a...
My name is Fernando Bassoberry. I'm a physician here in Boston. Congratulations for your honorary degree. I want to know, as a Bolivian, or you said there is a certain amount of funds or shares that eventually, once you're 65 years old, you are going to get. What sort of portfolio or plan, or who is managing that money to assure a 20-year-old, 30-year-old, or whoever, Bolivian, that eventually when they're 65, they're going to see that money?
Well, when you're 20 or 30 years old, you're immortal, so you don't need that money. I mean, you know, young people never think they'll ever die. And, but that said, this pension fund, there's two pension funds. There's the individual capitalization pension funds, which is based on payroll deductions, where the people and that's administered privately. We've done an international bidding process, and two companies have won it. One an American-Spanish consortium, another is a Spanish consortium. And then these funds, which is a collective capitalization fund, these shares, are put in the hands of these same private managers who pay out the bonus, and they manage these shares. They will be put on the market, they will be sold, they will be bought, and the portfolio will be diversified over time. And as we estimate the payout rhythm and the growth of population and all that, it should last till everybody who's 18 finishes their lifetime, and that should give time for the individual capitalization to become universal. As you know, a great part of our population does not work in the formal sector, but under the new pension fund reform, you can save money and have, you know, death insurance and have a pension by making monthly contributions. So we think that this system will go out and the new system will come in, and we're rather satisfied because we think those companies were made by the people who today will share the benefits. And the new system will go, but it's totally privately administered like Chile. We did, as I said, 2 companies have been selected, and after 5 years it'll be open to anybody coming in and freedom to pick it. But right now it's privately administered pension funds taking care of this fund, the capitalization fund, the collective capitalization fund, and the individual capitalization fund.
I am Ronald McLean from Bolivia, Mr. President. We all like the changes to stick, and not only to stick, but to develop. A great deal of effort and sacrifice has been involved and work over these years on these reforms, but the polls show that people are not going to vote very much for the party, for your party in the next election. And of course that party would have guaranteed that the measures and the reforms would have stayed. Don't you think that perhaps for such transcendental reforms, it was needed to have also the other political parties more involved in the reforms, even though they would have probably at the beginning resisted those reforms? Because now these political parties are really educating the people for the electoral process to go against the reforms, and I think that they are undoing a lot of the work that you have done during your government. Don't you think that you would do it a little bit different and have them come and join and be part of the reforms instead of having been left out of the reform process and then become a sort of critics of those reforms?
Well, I think there's 2 answers to that. First of all, I don't know a way, and this was related to what Jeff said before, change, and that's one of the theories, has to be radical, it has to be comprehensive, and it has to be, you know, coherent. And that is not compatible with opposition politics, simply because the pressure groups are so vocal. Remember, you're hurting private enterprise when you capitalize these companies, because many of these people were selling and doing business deals, as you know. Now they have to go out and do something different, which they can. But so I don't know how you can take a lollipop away from a baby without pulling it. And you can't argue it out, especially when you have all these interest groups marching in the streets and they can see that they can make political hay. You're right, and the greater effort should have been done, but you well know that on many laws we spent hundreds of hours with teachers' unions, with workers in the companies trying to convince them, and they understand consensus as doing nothing. because they're scared to death of a party that does something because that party may stay a long time. And it's hard to say. You have to invest your popularity, and I don't know. I don't know if it could have really been done that differently. You know, it was hard enough to hold the coalition together. And probably it could have been done, but again, it comes back to communication. If more politics had been worked, you could probably gotten a better consensus around it. But I think it was difficult because the feudal pressure groups were just too vocal, too powerful, and too hurt. And that makes it very hard to convince opposition to come along. And, you know, it's hard enough to convince official parties to do it. Opposition parties is too much to ask for. But again, I don't know. Maybe I can answer that question better after 2 or 3 years. I remember when I won the '82 election by a narrow margin, everybody said, well, you know, they would have voted for you. They wouldn't have done all this fraud and all that if you hadn't treated them that bad. And I always say I wouldn't have won the election if I hadn't given them hell. It's hard to know.
Well, Goni, I don't know what it says for your answers, but every answer you give, 2 more people come into line on both sides. We have time for one more question, and I'd like to invite you for the question.
My name is Maria Latour. I actually worked for you with Ed Riley in the Sawyer Miller Group a couple of years ago. I'm wondering what plans you foresee or what you foresee happening in the rural sector as far as employment, something other than subsistence agriculture, and as well as an alternative to the coca production.
Well, I think that's the big challenge for the future. We've put out a plan called the productive transformation of the country, of the agricultural sector. It's very related to investigation. I believe the big solution for poverty is microcredit. Again, I believe very much, and this may be just romantic, I believe that only people can solve their own problems, especially poor people. So if you give them a credit, which is based on solidarity, and you know, they can go out and buy a pig, they'll do something about it if they can get credit. If they can get education, they'll be able to do something with that credit. And if they have a comprehension of new techniques and transfers that can permit them to do it. I think that's the challenge for the future, and I hope that challenge is undertaken. But already with popular participation, with this great amount of money that's been sent out to the countryside, 20% of the revenues. It's just one department used to get 1,600,000 Bolivianos. That one department of very poor people, Potosí, gets 90 million Bolivianos. That's the difference between 93 and 97. And that sort of transfer, education transfers and things are leading it. And I was at a seminar and I went out to together with Jimena. She was out there looking at an integral nutrition and education out in a small town in Potosí. And I went there to pay homage to a great president we had at the time of the Civil War in the United States. And he signed the first treaty with Abraham Lincoln, by the way. And I went out to see him because he created these territorial jurisdiction. He created them, and they were never applied until 100 and some years later. We did it. And so I went out to visit him, and we've had a very good agricultural year in Bolivia. It's rained, and it's been good weather. And I said to him, well, I suppose as farmers you're very unhappy because although you produced a lot, the price is going down. And they said, no, we're exporting everything we produce. And I said, it can't be. Are you going through all the process? No, we put it in a truck and take it over to Chile and Peru at the night. And so we're exporting everything we produce. There's a change when you create macroeconomic conditions of stability and of empowerment. Many surprises will be born, which I can't say will happen automatically, the invisible hand of the market. I think there's very important policies to get going, but the only way to defeat poverty is, I think, the education and the health of women and rural investment. But I hope the next government does that. That's the next challenge that we have to spend. 3 out of 4 illiterates are women. Investing in women's education does much more for their health and the children's health than any other type of investment. Forget health investment, they just need a little bit of education. And I think there's a lot of things to be done, and it's out in the rural sector. Bolivia, luckily, 50% is still in the rural sector, because one of the biggest worries I have for Latin America is that when they move into cities, the problem becomes compounded. They have community, they have family, they have some sort of infrastructure which they don't have in cities. So the big challenge is to take services to them in the country before they move in the cities where you can't afford the services. We're working hard on it, and I think the biggest step is we're giving them the wherewithal to do it themselves.
Well, on behalf of all of us here, we're really grateful that you've been able to join us and share the wisdom. You've made tomorrow's lecture very easy. I hope everyone was listening. But let me thank you very much and congratulate you on these wonderful accomplishments.